Welcome to my channel. Today I'd like to show you how to cast plaster shapes using a mold, and we're going to be using plaster of Paris. So let me just show you what it is. Plaster of Paris, sometimes known as plaster of Paris or Egyptian skimming plaster, but plaster of Paris is what we're going to be using. And when you make that, you could use any kind of a mold, but you can see that these ones I'm using have been made for purposes of chocolate making, so you get quite nice shapes and nice detail. And once you've actually cast these molds, you could use them to decorate any number of different surfaces. You could put them on boxes, you could put them on pots, you could make them into fridge magnets, all kinds of things, but they really are quite fun to do. When I had my shop, I used to often do this as a children's party, and that was great. So the normal chocolate mold is either a plastic one like this one, or you could use one of the modern silicone ones. It's just that the shell shape that I'm using today is a plastic one. I like to work with this on a suspended surface, so I've just got an empty plastic container here, and you will also notice that my container that I'm using for the mold is actually wet. It's never a good idea to put the plaster of Paris, which is this dry powder, dry into the mold, because that actually creates problems. I have with me too some water, and I have a little spritz bottle as well, which has water in just in case I need it. So the perfect ratio is normally about 50% water and 50% plaster. So the secret here is to half fill the mold, like so, and I'm just going to do the three bigger ones because they are easier to see. And then you want to just gently start to sprinkle the plaster into that. You'll see that this soaks into the water very, very easily. And where you have narrow bits like this, you do have to be extremely careful that you put plaster there, because it's very easy to forget them. And then you take your mold out and you find that you've actually got nothing. So you want to keep just putting plaster in till you can see that the water is absorbing it all and you're seeing less water. If there is excess water, don't worry about it, because you can easily just tip that off the side of the mold and into the container below. Okay, so once you can see it's filling up nicely like this, I'm going to tap it. I'm afraid it is going to make a bit of a noise, but bear with me, it won't take long. So I'm just going to tap it like this, which means that the plaster starts to settle into the mold. And if necessary, you could just take something like a sucker stick and just scoop the dry plaster into the mold. If you feel that you've got excess of the water, then all you can do is just take your mold and just tip it sideways slightly so that it pours into the container below, or as it's doing here, filling up another mold of mine. Anyway, so I'm going to continue to add some plaster, because as you can see that this is still very sloppy and it's not going to set very well if it is as liquid as that. Keep filling them up and then tap again so that this settles. If you do have a dry spot like this, then you need to just take a little kebab stick and mix it in so that the moisture is soaking into the dry plaster. You don't want a lump of very dry plaster. Make sure that it's into the corners of the molds. Scoop this little bit in here. Any excess moisture that's lying on the surface, you can just gently scoop into the mold if it has got slightly drier. There we go. So I'm using what I've got on the surface of my plastic mold just to fill that up. And then I'm just going to drag my kebab stick over the surface of it to try and level off the product a little bit more. Make sure that I haven't got any gaps. Going to again tap it, because this will self-level the mold. Oopsie. I need to have that hooked onto the end. It also helps to tap like this, and then you get rid of these little air bubbles which you see poke up to the top. And if you tap them, you'll see that more rise, and that's actually really good, because then you get rid of all of that could create a weak spot, especially on a very, very low profile mold. Okay, so gladly going to just tap it again, move the moisture into the mold, mix up any little dry spots, and then scrape the kebab sticker across the top. You could mix this up in a jug beforehand, so I know some people who prefer to actually do it in a jug, but I would do that if I was doing bigger molds in larger quantities. I do find it's very wasteful if you're doing smaller quantities to suddenly have this jug of plaster. And if you've ever worked with plaster of Paris before, you will know that it starts to harden within a couple of minutes, so you haven't got a lot of time to play around. So this method actually works for me. If you have found that you've got a lot of mess on the side of your mold, then what you could always do is just to take a piece of paper towel, tear it up into smaller bits so that you could actually make a slightly more pointed bit and just quietly go around the edges and neaten it up. If you have a very thin film of plaster around the edge, that's not going to make any difference to your unmolding at the end. But what you don't want to find is that you've filled in so much plaster around this edge that it becomes really thick and that it's going to just come off with the actual mold itself. Right, so plaster of Paris is quite interesting. While it's curing, which means that while it's setting, you'll notice if you work with it in larger quantities that it actually gets warm, and then it also expands. So for those of you who have ever made topiary trees and you want to do this perhaps in a terracotta pot, don't. Do it in a plastic pot and then put your plastic pot inside the terracotta pot, because when it expands, if it is in a rigid mold like a terracotta pot, it will crack it. Experience has taught me that. So please just learn from the experience of mine and my many students over the years who insisted on doing things in terracotta pots. You're going to need to leave this aside for about an hour or so. The mold will harden, but it won't actually be completely dry yet. You can tip it out then and leave it to dry. It will look slightly almost yellowish white when it's just tipped out, and if you leave it overnight to dry, it becomes white, and this you could paint then with acrylic paints or with oils, whatever you want to do. When you come to unmold something, you'll often notice that this is the film that I was talking about that's on the surface that's just going to break up into crumbs, and it's not really going to affect your unmolding. But you want to just place your hand over the edge of the mold and tip it over, and then just tap like this. Oh, there we go. And then it releases. If you find you've got little rough edges around the sides, sometimes you can just smooth them out with your finger, but you could use some very fine grit sandpaper, like water sandpaper, just to sand those edges. And because you've taken care, you've got a nice smooth background, so this will stick nicely onto a surface. The basics of working with plaster molds. And as I said, you could work either with a plastic mold like this one, or you could work with a silicone mold, but the sky's the limit. And once you know the basics and you know what to expect, it's easy to do. So please have fun. Bye.